I first of all would like to introduce Jody, who of course is the editor-in-chief at The Forward in America. Speaker Klein, who I'm delighted to say is joining us in his first public appearance as the interim editor-in-chief at the Jerusalem Post. So thank you for joining us so soon after coming to office. And Richard Ferrer, a fellow I know fairly well, my boss at the Jewish News. I just wanted to say, first of all, before we kick off, that this is a particularly poignant occasion for me. Exactly 1 year ago, almost to the moment, I was arriving at Heathrow Airport, bound for Ben Gurion, where I was to bury my father, who passed away a couple of days earlier. And to think about that journey and to think about what Israel has suffered since then, and the fact that he is buried in Jerusalem makes this an especially poignant occasion for me. I would like to split today's session, if I can, into three sections. First of all, talking about the role of Jewish media during this period. Second of all, going on to the issues of Israel diaspora affairs, a topic that Speaker is fairly familiar with, I understand. And finally, talking about issues around the region and the future of the region. If I can kick off by saying, as news editor of the Jewish News over the last 10 weeks and for many years before that, the difference between our newsroom and our output between the 6th of October and the 7th of October, those early hours of the morning on Shabbat, was massive. The changes that had to be made, the different elements that had to be put into place. Obviously, our viewers will have seen the huge output from all the outlets and many other Jewish papers around the world. But I'm wondering if you can reflect on those changes that you had to put in place. What didn't we see behind the scenes that led to you being able to respond to the crisis in the way that you have? And if Jody, if you can kick off with that.
Thanks, Justin. It's nice to be with you guys, with all of you. I guess I'm not sure I understand the question fully. I mean, when news happens, journalists respond, and we do everything that we can, and then we do more when it's the news that's this big. So we we immediately sent, it turned out to be our opinion editor, but who played reporter for a few weeks, immediately to report from Israel, and the rest of the staff and all of our kind of freelance network just kind of went into overdrive to cover the crisis and its aftermath. And that has taken a lot of different shapes over the 10 weeks. I mean, there was 1 week where, as the campus crisis was heating up, we sent 11 reporters to 11 US campuses to get a clearer picture on what it was really like to be Jewish on campus. I myself just got back from 11 days reporting on the ground in Israel. We are spending money that we don't have to cover this war because we need to. And we've launched a special fundraising campaign to support it. But regardless of how that comes out, we're going to cover it in the way it needs to be covered. We've seen our audience, I think, double and triple around at different weeks, and the point not quite as the big growth that the Times of Israel has seen, becoming the fastest growing website in the world over the last 10 weeks. But we've posted a job for a full-time person based in Israel that I'm interviewing finalists for right now. And we've seen also our fundraising increase. The other thing that we did, we didn't do it behind the scenes, we did it out front, but we immediately took our paywall down for all coverage related to the war so that people would have universal access to our journalism. And we have since, I mean, we had a plan to do this, but we have since taken our paywall down fully and forever. We are now a membership-based, reader-supported, philanthropically supported nonprofit newsroom in the model of in America National Public Radio, where everybody can always read anything at the Forward for free. So, we are just all doing everything that we can to cover the story in the fullest and fairest way possible. We also, one of our hallmarks is to have a broad opinion platform that includes all the different perspectives of the Jewish world. And so we've seen also a rush for people to contribute personal essays and opinion articles and experiences from Israel, from across the Jewish world. And we've been publishing, our output has something like doubled also in terms of the amount of articles that we publish each week.
Richard, one of the hallmarks of those first couple of weeks in particular for us was seeing Jewish news for the first time in history transformed into almost a national publication. And by that, I mean that we were being approached for comment on an hourly basis by the nationals. We were breaking a lot of stories. We were revealing, because we had those contacts, we were embedded in the community. Unfortunately, a lot of the initial deaths and hostages among British people. How would you answer that question? What do you think were the big changes that we put in place immediately to be able to cope?
Yeah, one of the first tragedies that we reported, of course, was Nathaniel Young, who was the first British victim who died with his unit on the 7th. Yeah, as you know, we saw national and international media come to us to access the community, and we found ourselves helping and coordinate the national media, TV and radio and print, organizing events. We did the Bring Them Home balloon campaign across, was it 20 cities around the world. We cleared our pages for free advertising so that organizations that were supporting Israel at that time could publicize their good work. And yet, just like the Forward, we're doing things we can't really afford, because I think we lost thousands of pounds of paid-for advertising in that first week as we tried to just do our bit to spread the word and leave a positive impact. The hardest thing for me, and you know, you've been in these news meetings with me right the way through, has been to try and divorce my emotions. You know, I've been a journalist for 30 years, and I was entirely unprepared emotionally for what happened. Those first few raw days were impossible, and that issue of that first week was the hardest thing that I think any of us have had to do. And the hardest thing of all was, I think, to disconnect from the anger and the trauma, because you're suffering the same trauma as the people you're interviewing. You're going through the same ordeal. Obviously, we're not in Israel. We're not on the coalface. But our colleague Yael probably won't mind me sharing this with you, but our colleague lost a brother in Gaza the week before last. You know, we're having to console each other while reporting and while writing on what's happening, while doing a responsible job, providing crucial content, being a community service as much as being a community newspaper, and trying as best we can to hold the middle ground where people of good conscience can come together, feel comfortable, and try and control the urge to let our anger, fear, paranoia control the output. Because once we do that, I think we're starting to fail in our role. So I think that's really important, to use moderation and to be a place where people can coalesce. That I think was the most important, responsible thing for me. And I think hopefully you'll agree, Justin, our team.
Indeed. Svika, you, of course, are and were on the ground throughout this. I mean, you obviously you keep Shabbat. How did you first find out about what happened, and how did you respond personally and at the Post?
So it was Saturday morning, Simchat Torah, and my wife tells me in the morning, she's like, "I think you need to work." I was like, you know, and we had, by the way, we had like 3 families over for a meal, and I realized I needed to work, and I was, you know, theoretically, like, you know, I'm like, should I ask a rabbi? And I was like, you know what? People need to know. And we are a source of information from Israel. We have to operate. But many people that work for us keep Shabbat, and you know, our, you know, defense reporter who covers the IDF keeps Shabbat, and unlike me, he would not work on Shabbat even in this type of situation, and I respect that. But then what do you do? And one of my kids, my 7-year-old boy, like, he said, I was in this room actually. He's like, Abba, when I'm in this room, I feel like it's Shabbat, and when I feel like it's not, it's in the middle of the week, and when I'm outside, it's Shabbat. And it kind of was like that. I'll just say on a personal note, like most of my neighbors, like the men, are not home or haven't been home for weeks, for months, or coming back occasionally. So there's a situation where there's a bunch, like, you know, we're talking about tens of thousands of single moms. Something that is difficult because they may have to work, you know, many of them are working and they have children, and there wasn't school at the beginning, right? So it's such a complicated situation. And do your editors work from home or do they come in, right? Like, when do we start coming back into the office after threats of, you know, of missiles, etc. And one kind of challenge is, you know, as an Israeli news outlet, first of all, the first 10 days of the war, we were targeted by the worst cyber attack that we've ever known. And the top minds at Google and other companies were working on it day and night to see how, because we kept on just collapsing. Obviously, the traffic has grown tremendously, but that definitely affects it. There's also a bunch of like disinformation that, you know, pro-Palestinian groups are doing, using our name or reaching out, even to Elon, who reached out to me. Someone from the UK with a UK number reached out to him to interview him for the Jerusalem Post, with broken Hebrew, like, you know, a Google Translate type Hebrew. So it's a very weird situation. I'll just add one more thing is, there's so many stories to tell, but we can't, because there's, you know, 1,000, 300, 200, whatever people killed. Now, every one of us, and definitely an Israeli news outlet, will, you know, write about a person killed. But how do you write about so many in such a short time? How do you give attention to every single hostage family? So we're trying, you know, always to be creative, and like, as you said, you know, and part of our reporting staff is on reserve in the Army. So you have to be creative in getting, whether at philanthropic or you know, I had volunteers at a certain point, like sit down, watch TV, and send me transcriptions and turning them into articles. It's being creative, but also, as you said, it's very personal because everyone has a personal connection.
Richard, if I can come to you for the next question, start off with the next question. We published a poll, of course, today suggesting that nearly 50% of people in the UK feel less safe, as a poll that we conducted with the Jewish Leadership Council. Can you give a flavour to a global audience as to the temperature of the community as it stands? And perhaps Jody can take the question afterwards about in terms of America.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer, and I've thought of nothing else and lived and breathed nothing else in the last 69 days. Look, the eyes and the hearts of British Jews are firmly on in Israel and Gaza, as they have been for the last 10 weeks. Elon, now our previous speaker, he was in the Gaza envelope earlier this week, and he said something that really stuck with me. He said it's still October the 7th for Israel. You know, a traumatized people that haven't moved on from that day. Well, here in the UK, it's very much December the 14th. It's very much 69 days later. You know, the national agenda has moved on. The public mood has changed. Memories of what have happened have faded in the national conscience. So, you know, it's been 10 weeks of British Jews thinking twice before they go to the centre of town on a Saturday, because there are some pro-Hamas supporters hijacking pro-Palestine events. 10 weeks of seeing kidnap posters being ripped down. 10 weeks of seeing a 1,500%, 4,000% rise in certain areas of anti-Semitism. But we knew things were going to move on. Absolutely, it was, and no man or woman of good conscience can see the horrific scenes in Gaza now and be expected to take an unemotional view of what's taking place, or to look at the thing from a 16-year perspective since 2006 and why it's now coming to this nightmarish conclusion. But for all those reasons, we did our first polling with a polling company called Survation. It was about 800 Jewish people in the UK we surveyed in November. 77% now say they feel less safe. And interestingly, institutions have also come under the microscope as far as the Jewish community is concerned. 64%, I think it is, now say that they trust the BBC, an organization they pay a tax to, a subscription to every year, less than they did. So whether or not these feelings remain large and significant in weeks and months to come, as this ends, and it will end whenever that is, at some point next year, and the new status quo and the new reality takes hold, whether this is a lasting change that the Jewish community has to come to terms with, I don't know. I don't think it is, because the cabinet, the shadow cabinet, the prime minister, the next prime minister, Keir Starmer, the king, they've all had the Jewish community's back, absolutely, and I feel reassured that the future can be indicated by the support of the current government and the future government, and not by the temperature on the streets, which I'm hoping will start to calm down eventually. And the Jewish community, and I always say this just to end, the thing that I've learned more in 14 years than anything else in my job is how it angers me that the Jewish community is forced to be defined by anti-Semitism. It doesn't define itself by anti-Semitism. It's anti-Semites that define it as such. And I want to get back to defining Jewish life in Britain by our contributions, and not by how bigoted people view us or wish to view us.
And Jody, I mean, no one who cares about Israel or the Jewish communities around the world will have avoided seeing those scenes in Congress just last week, the congressional hearings with the 3 university heads, and obviously the subsequent resignation of one of them. To what extent has that added to the feelings of general fears of American Jewry, and to what extent is life on campus symptomatic of a wider malaise?
Good questions, and we have something like 7 million Jews in this country, and there's probably about 7 million answers, or maybe more than that. But I do think you have to distinguish between safety and comfort. And, the Jews in America and the Jews in the United States have for my lifetime, and certainly maybe even a little longer, have a very comfortable existence. We've been prosperous and successful, and have not been discriminated against systematically. We've been not, shut out of universities and jobs and clubs and residential neighborhoods. It's been a long time since that was true. And so I think what's been unfolding on American campuses and in some workplaces and in some neighborhoods since October 7th has been really uncomfortable. And that's really new for us. People have felt alienated and isolated and not quite sure, especially in the elite institutions and in the liberal coastal cities where people generally are very left wing and allied with the Black Lives Matter movement, where they're now seeing a lot of tension between their liberal Zionist values and the far left. But I think, and some people will articulate that as feeling unsafe, but most of the change that we've seen and the incidents that are recorded by like the ADL of increased anti-Semitism are really not, violent, and they're really not attacks. They're mostly about speech, hate speech, harassment, difficult images in social media, some marches in our streets. And so I think people are feeling quite uncomfortable, but I'm not sure that it really is about being unsafe. They may feel unsafe because they're so used to being comfortable. It is all very jarring, the kind of reshifting of the map. And you are seeing in a lot of the kind of middle and in the liberal Zionist spaces an upsurge of people looking to communities to connect. There's increased synagogue attendance and things like that are happening. And you can see Jews sort of gathering a little bit to build our sense of comfort up. I will say a couple of weeks ago, I was at the University of California in Los Angeles, and I did a panel with 3 students at the Hillel there. And one young woman, very articulate, talked about a feeling of unsafety on a day when she was literally like, she was trying to study for a test, and there was a Students for Justice in Palestine rally that sort of came right by where she was sitting. And she talked about feeling unsafe. And I kind of drilled into her a little bit about like, what do you mean by unsafe? And she really said, you know, it was more unsettled than unsafe. So I think we want to be careful about, you know, 1,200 people were killed for being Jewish on October 7th in Israel. They were unsafe from a terrorist threat. And that's not what we are experiencing on American campuses right now, even though it's really uncomfortable.
One of the things we also saw from the polling we did this week was quite a high percentage of people who were thinking maybe they don't have a future in the UK, that they were, you know, starting to think about that, you know, that old adage about, you know, having their bags packed just in case. Just Jodie, I wonder if you could quickly come in.
I mean,
that chat we're also hearing in America
a tiny bit, and you know, we also heard it on November, whatever it was, 2016, when everybody, you know, was going to pack their bags after Trump got elected. And you know, this is like a thing people say and not a thing people do. I am quite, you know, one thing we have seen. I mean, I think it'll be very interesting to see Aliyah patterns both ways, right? We have seen an uptick right after October 7th. I heard from several heads of Jewish day schools, and I think the JTA published a good article, which I'll share in the chat in a minute, about Israelis who left Israel and wanted to enroll in day schools. I think, you know, how long those people will stay, whether they're going to make Yerida or they're going to go back to Israel soon, who knows? Whether people who were planning to make Aliyah this year will continue with their plans, will postpone them, will never go. I mean, that'll be a really interesting storyline to watch. I also heard something just last night at my own synagogue that I thought was interesting, which was the head of the religious school told me that 15 Israeli families had joined the synagogue and joined the religious school in the last couple of weeks. Not people who had moved to the United States, people who were living in New Jersey, but not belonging to a synagogue, and decided to join up or at least send their kids to religious school. She told me of one family who said to her, you know, my kid knows he's Israeli. I need him to know he's Jewish. And I thought that was interesting. I haven't seen a trend story about that yet, so we might assign one. But anyway, I think this question, I don't see people really. I do think people are saying like, oh, Brett Stevens has been banging this drum for a while now that, you know, we should be, that as anti-Semitism rises here, we should be conscious that our kids may need to live in Israel soon. I think it's a really great line for like an op-ed, and not really, you know, it takes a lot for people to change where they live. And we all know that Israel is a tough place to live. We're seeing that right now with 300,000 people called up for reserve duty. But, you know, long before that, finding an apartment you can afford is a whole nightmare. The cost of living is very difficult in a lot of ways. So I don't know anybody who literally has their bags packed. I do know people who are using that rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I totally get that. I think that we saw during the Corbyn era in the UK, again, this same conversation about what it would take to actually cause people to leave the country. And who knows what would have happened if he had got into power. However, you know, at the same time, clearly in Europe, certainly parts of Europe, there is clearly a problem with extremists and with extremist Islamism. And, you know, we've seen many incidents over the years to realize that when they talk about threatening Jewish institutions, schools, synagogues, they have done that in places like Germany, in Belgium, and so on. I'm just wondering, Speaker, when you kind of look on as an Israeli, but someone who is so grounded in diaspora affairs, what are you hearing from Israelis who are looking on at what's going on in Europe? I mean, I've heard people say, you know, I've had people from Israel call me and ask if I'm feeling safe while they're going through what they're going through.
Right. So we're a nation that's get used to situations very quickly, you know. In 2015, when I did a video in France and with the kippah, and I received anti-Semitism, people were like, is it safe to go to France? I was like, well, you live in Israel? Is it safe? I mean, is it safe to be in Israel? I don't know, you know. And then also then there was anti-Semitism in America. People are like, wait, can you find me someone? You know, Israeli media like, find me someone that decided to not wear a kippah in America. I was like, well, you know, a few years ago, right? There aren't so many of it. Like, it's not a big phenomenon. I will add about Aliyah what you said. I think it's interesting. You know, obviously, you know, I remember with, you know, Corbyn, and I think I even came to the Jewish news offices a few days before the election, and there was a feeling, you know, of British Jews possibly, whatever, and obviously he didn't win. But in 2023, you know, and when there's a war in Ukraine, you see, I mean, most Aliyah to Israel happens when things are really bad, when there's a war. And from Western countries, as Jody said, you don't just pick up your bags. In France, we've seen things like this happen a few years later, though, because people have to sell their house in Paris, and you can't buy a house in Tel Aviv at the same size if you're selling your house in Paris. So it's complicated. So I was very moved that, you know, we've been, you know, for 10 weeks, all the TV stations are like nonstop news, even though they're not news channels. And there's always like these photos in the background. And there was a certain point when I saw the pictures were also of Jewish communities, whether supporting Israel or suffering or under attack with anti-Semitic attacks. And that's when I felt that finally Israelis are starting to get it, that we really are one collective. And, you know, I'll add, you said, you know, about, you know, Israel-diaspora relations. So, you know, unfortunately, it took a war for Jody to hire someone in Israel, right? It took, you know, and I'm trying to rehire someone in the US. But Israeli media in general in Hebrew isn't, you know, covering the diaspora. Now they are more. We're good at covering each other when things are bad. But one thing I think we should take from this is we should be learning about each other culturally, you know, not just the dirty, disgusting politics that every one of our countries has, but also when things are good. And that's not something that we're, you know, and obviously media focuses on the negative, but, you know, if you're telling a story constantly for a number of years, it clicks and people are able to understand it. So
on that topic, you read my mind, because I was going to then come to you with a question about Israel diaspora affairs. I was talking to a very wise fellow this week, I thought, who said that if anything comes out of this period, it has to be the clarity that Israel is strengthened by the diaspora, and without Israel, the Jewish communities around the world are significantly weakened. I think in the past, as you've hinted at there, the relationship has gone quite heavily in one direction, and a bit less so, maybe a lot less so, in the other. Do you feel that this period is a watershed moment in those relations? Do you think Israelis are now? I was speaking to Netta earlier on about the fact that a lot of Israelis have woken up to the concerns around anti-Semitism, which perhaps they thought had been overplayed by the diaspora before. Do you think there is a greater understanding, and do you think it will lead to closer relations in some way going forward?
There is a greater understanding, but I wouldn't overestimate it, because we are not even yet at a time of grieving, because we're not yet, you know, there. Yes, we see, you know, every single, you know, delegation of families of hostages goes to countries around the world, and the first stop or the people organizing it are the Jewish community. But, you know, kind of like COVID, I'm afraid that we're just going to go back, and then, you know, but I think Israelis changed, secular Israelis, which are very different than secular Jews in the US and in America, have become more Jewish. I haven't seen any surveys yet, but like you see these kibbutzim, super idealistic, like classic, as Jody said, you know, progressive Zionism, you know, singing Am Yisrael Chai and Shira Ma'alot and whatever when people are being free.
It's even more than that, Svika. I mean, I met two different so the wife of a hostage I interviewed recently, who totally secular or traditional family, says she's keeping Shabbat and lighting, you know, and I saw her like saying Tehillim. And the survivors that I interviewed from Kfar Aza, same deal.
Wow.
And I know it's true because I actually sent her a text that was during her Shabbat and she didn't answer it.
By the way, we're publishing that story in our print edition tomorrow.
Excellent. Oh, thank you. And also, I just edited a story about Israeli kind of hip designers and like leftists and secular Tel Avivis who are all like wearing Magen David, and some of their quotes are literally like, "I was Israeli before, I'm Jewish now." So I think that's like definitely a phenomenon.
Right. So I wanted to add to that and to what you said about the Israelis in America. I mean, there's actually some sort of a paper coming out soon about that. Israelis in America always said, you know, or Israel, like, you know, emissaries of the Jewish agency who were secular said, I went out on shlichut. I was an Israeli. I came back as a Jew, right? Because unfortunately, in Israel, they didn't have that.
Well, they also see different ways of being Jewish here that are more accessible to them.
Exactly,
think.
Right, exactly. And then,
if I had to put money on it, I don't think will last. I do not think all these secular people are going to like stay religious.
No, but it's not being religious; it's being Jewish.
Well,
that's
maybe,
what I'm saying.
Sure. But anyway, I think on the thing about, you know, how is this going to affect Israel diaspora relations? I mean, I just think there's like so many different axes of that, right? So you certainly see, we've been seeing in polls for a long time that younger generations of American Jews are alienated from Israel or anti-Israel, whatever. You are seeing obviously a much more virulent strain of that. And I think when I was in Israel, you know, the Israeli left, American Israelis, sorry, are kind of horrified by what they're seeing there and really feel what is going on in America, what is going on with the left in America, etc. So there's one element of divide. At the same time, all Israel is like very happy with where Biden, I mean, I left before Biden started criticizing Netanyahu, but in general, the polls are showing incredible support for Washington and Biden. And I think that the non-anti-Zionist American Jew who has also been sort of like, yeah, Israel, whatever, is now very much more focused on Israel and connected to Israel. I feel like a lot of people in the sort of, again, liberal Zionist, leftist, politically in U.S. politics, feel much, very pulled to Israel right now.
But also I would say Haredi Jews.
And Haredi Jews
in Israel. You had Israel say, go out to the rally. Afterwards, they weren't so happy.
Yeah.
But you know, it's a big deal.
So I think I just think it's like not so clear. Like it's not so clear, you know? Yeah. Adalia Shineland had a very good piece. I think it was in Haaretz this morning, analyzing a lot of polls of American Jews that showed that, you know, what's getting the headlines about, you know, the Jewish Voice for Peace rally and anti-Zionism is really a fringe small group, and that the bulk of America, the mainstream America, middle America, is very supportive of Israel and of even how it's prosecuting the war. So we'll see.
Richard, in terms of British Jewry, historically, it's been the case that British Jewry has been closer, possibly because of the geography, to Israel. You've had much higher percentage of people, you know, automatically visiting Israel at a young age and so on. But obviously we saw in the last 10 months before the war and before the attacks that those relations were particularly strained by judicial reform. You know, we covered that very, very heavily. Do you have hopes that this will set diaspora-Israel relations on a new path, or do you also think it's a short-lived phenomenon?
It would be a silver lining if that was one of the byproducts. Traditionally, it's very, very one-sided. Traditionally, it's we love you, you want us to make Aliyah, and that's really the line in the sand. You know, EasyJet or Wizz Air suddenly do a service from Luton Airport to Tel Aviv. It's like this big, massive thing for the Jewish community in the UK, and it brings us even closer. You know, Jewish schools, charities, UJIA. We live and we breathe to serve and support and celebrate. Do we celebrate Israel? Whereas the Aliyah minister in the Knesset tends to be the grumpiest man in the cabinet, or the grumpiest person in the cabinet every time. So it's very, very difficult to have that reciprocal relationship. But look, I think the last few months has blurred the distinction between Jews and Israel and the diaspora and Jews just generally, to the point where at the moment, I don't even feel it exists. I know there has been a clear definition between Jewish life in the UK, British Jewish life, and the identity that we have as British Jews, and how it's completely distinct from Jews in Israel. I've written about this in the past when Netanyahu a few years ago said, all Jews come make Aliyah. And I wrote a piece saying, no way I'm going to make Aliyah. I'm British. I'm not Israeli. I couldn't even think about doing that. Our columnist Josh Glancy wrote a very interesting piece for us last week. David Baddiel, who's a very proud Jew, he's just got the word Jew on his Twitter handle. He has absolutely no interest, or had no interest, in Israel. He was very derogatory and derisory about Israel. And Josh Glancy called it Baddiel's fence. He sat on Baddiel's fence and refused to come off of the fence. And now that fence has been well and truly obliterated by what happened 10 weeks ago, because October the 7th felt like an attack on every Jew. And it didn't matter if it was in Israel or London or Jerusalem or Manchester. It was an attack on every Jew around the world. So if that binds us together in some profound way, then yeah, maybe it is a silver lining.
We've only got 10 minutes left together, so I'm going to move on to the next section of the questions, if that's okay. As Elon was asked about earlier on, Zippy Kotoveli, the UK ambassador, has made it very clear, if Netanyahu hadn't done before, that a two-state solution isn't part of the vision of, well, certainly her vision, and one would assume the vision of the Israeli government. And I think Elon, at the moment, pretty much confirmed that, in light of the fact that neither Hamas or Fatah are perhaps ready as partners for a potential peace. I'm wondering, from your perspective, if we start with Speaker on that one, do you feel that that is a position that is born in just simple reality, that they're just stating an obvious fact? Or, like Simon Sebag Montefiore said on Twitter earlier on today, is that simply a sign that no positive progress can be made towards a peaceful solution of any description whilst the Netanyahu government is still in place?
A two-state solution is not only not relevant in the Netanyahu government, it's not relevant in any potential future government that we can, whether Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz being the head. A two-state solution wouldn't have happened before October 7th, and even more so now. The Israeli left is shrinking. The center is growing at the moment in the surveys. Many on the left, Jody kind of touched on, I think, a little bit, feel betrayed by the international progressive community. And October 7th, the people kill again. I'm religious. I live in Efrat near Jerusalem. So I didn't personally know people from those kibbutzim who were killed. But the people who were killed, many of them were peace activists. Now, when you speak to them today, again, not all of them, but many of them, because they're speaking from emotion, and obviously they have all the right in the world to do so, want nothing to do with Gaza or with the Palestinians. You know, there's a really senior high-tech figure, I can't remember his name now, I'll remember in a second, and his daughter was killed at the Nova Festival. He actually invested and he built offices or plants in Gaza because he believed that if they have an economy, then things will change. And now he says, I think he still believes in a Palestinian state, but he doesn't see anything moving forward in the next few years. This is not something, but what we lack are alternatives, because there aren't many alternatives.
Yeah, Jody.
Well, I was going to say Asma, so you have to, it's fine to say that people have given up on a two-state solution, people don't see a partner, and all of it is true. And we are living through I was going to say the worst, but I don't think it is the worst necessarily, of what happens when you don't address the conflict. So the status quo, I mean, October 7th was a horrible thing in so many ways. And one of the other things it was proof text of the status quo being unsustainable, and the ignoring of the Palestinian question being creating backlash. And so the fact that the Palestinian Authority is such a mess does not help the Jewish state survive, like sort of focusing on that. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is that the real failure of the United States foreign policy towards the Middle East over the last 20 years is the way it has sort of allowed, it's not the United States' fault or problem to make the Palestinians have reasonable leadership, but to not have been working on that for the UN and the US and the EU and everybody who supposedly cares about the survival of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state and about Palestinian national sovereignty, for all of those entities, including American Jews, to not have been working on building up Palestinian alternatives that could be a good partner is a real shanda. And, this is one of the reasons that you see support for a two-state solution dropping on the Palestinian side, is because it's not their problem to solve, really. The conflict is a threat to Israel's survival as a Jewish and democratic state. And as we saw so tragically on October 7th, to Jewish lives. That's what's threatened by the ongoing conflict. So so the question again is Asma. So if not a two-state solution, then what? And whether it's, and there was a pretty good piece in the New York Times, I think it was yesterday, in the opinion section, with 10 different takes on what should happen with Gaza. And everybody should be thinking about it. I understand that Israelis, it's very difficult today with so many soldiers deployed, with funerals continuing, with people still being held in captivity. Totally very difficult to think about anything beyond ending the captivity, getting the hostages home, and ending the war. But it's not going to be okay to just say we can't do it. There's no solution. There's no two states. Then you're just right back where you were on October 6th. Maybe
can I just come back to speaker just a second?
Can I respond though? Because
I'm gonna ask you. Do you see an alternative? Because yes, the point that Jody makes is that, fine, no two-state solution. Let's say that's impossible at this point, but the Palestinians are still there. As far as it's not Israeli policy to wipe out all Palestinians. Absolutely, they're targeting as closely as they can Hamas operatives. So what is that alternative that you see at the moment? Because there has to be something. There has to be a day after the war. What happens when troops leave the Gaza Strip?
Well, first of all, as I said, there is no one solution that I have seen that I could say this is what I support. And there is a lack, and maybe we should be discussing it. But I just want to address what Jody said, and I think very highly of Jody. But we can't. It wasn't really blaming what you said, but leaving the Gaza Strip, as Richard said in 2005, and giving them, autonomy to do whatever they want, without asking for anything in return. Having people on the border volunteering in these kibbutzim to take them to hospitals because these children in Gaza were getting, cancer treatment, and then these people were killed, slaughtered, raped in the worst way possible. You cannot expect a country to want anything to do with that nation when you see Poles and the Palestinian Authority supporting Hamas. So
not wanting anything to do with it is, having a Palestinian state and ending the conflict is about separating. It's about separating. It's not about.
But when they have their own autonomy and they teach anti-Semitic content in their schools, that Jews, have big noses and are evil and may have horns on their head, just like the Nazis do, and they've been doing that, including in UNRWA schools. Nothing good is gonna happen from that, and the geography isn't really, a way where we can just do that and just block off, a group of people. So I don't have a solution, but I am trying to reflect that a majority of Israelis, the Knesset just, the government voted against allowing Palestinians to return into Israel to work. And even though this is the most right-wing Israeli government, other governments may have also approved this type of decision because people don't feel safe. They don't feel safe, even if it's a female, woman cleaning an elementary school, who may be a really good person. A large group of Israelis just don't feel like they're at a place at the moment to allow such a thing to happen, which is terrible.
Speaker, so we're running out of time. We've got 2 more minutes. I would like to try and end on a positive note if we at all can. As things we're probably not going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on this particular conversation. Maybe the next one we can all return. If I'd like to ask for everyone's thoughts on an element of light. See, we're talking about Hanukkah here. An element of light in this crisis, as hard as it is to find. And if I may use my editor's privilege to start, and I think that despite the UAE certainly joining, the vote for a ceasefire last week, despite the UAE being one of the first countries to condemn Israel for what turned out to be the Islamic Jihad rocket attack on the hospital in Gaza, it feels to me, and from what I'm hearing and the positive noises I'm hearing and the positive contacts I'm still retaining within the Gulf states and particularly within the UAE, that the Abraham Accords are poised, and it will depend obviously on what happens with the Israeli government and what happens with the future of Gaza. But everyone wants the Abraham Accords to return to exactly where they were and perhaps to move forward at an even faster pace, as strange as that seems at this particular moment. It was someone quite high up within the UAE that was the first person to approach me about whether members of the Jewish News staff were getting extra security as a result of being on the media a lot in recent weeks, and that really encouraged me. I found that very heartening. Richard, seeing as I've forgotten you were here for the last few minutes, do you want to give us a thought on any light that you've found in the last few weeks?
I was just composing my thoughts about Hotovelli, but you chose not to come to me on that one. So
unless you've got a solution, let's move on to the light bit.
Right. Bright spots.
Hotovelli.
It was mentioned about synagogue attendances going up. I think certainly there's a sense of communality and the community feeling that it needs to kind of be together at this time. I hope that sticks. certainly after COVID and we were separated for so long. It was heartening to be amongst 100,000 people at the largest ever rally against anti-Semitism since Cable Street in 1936, a couple of weeks ago. There was about a third of the entire Jewish community of the UK all in one place, which was quite lovely. The sales of Magen David's, mezuzahs are soaring. And like you, I'm having conversations and I'm getting a sense of reassurance that the Abraham Accords are holding firm, that the states that had signed and that were poised to sign, particularly Saudi Arabia, is holding firm, and that a wider regional peace accord could potentially be something that happens within a year or two of things calming down within Gaza. So that does give me hope for a positive future in both in the region and for Jewish life in general.
Jody, same question.
Yeah. Let's see. I think one thing first of all, readership of Jewish news organizations is up. That's a good thing.
Certainly.
The other thing is that one of the things I found in Israel, I'm sure Zvika is experiencing this. This is mostly like just among my friends from when I lived there. But there's this, in addition to all the Americans and probably Brits who are going over there to pick persimmons or whatever, a lot of Israelis are kind of like once a week going out on the farms and working on the kibbutz farms. And I think there's something, and I mean, really in general, all the volunteer stuff that is popping up in the organic way it's popping up is sort of incredible. These soldiers who are not in Gaza are clearly the best fed army in the history of the world, with all the like homemade food being sent down there.
And chefs also.
Yeah, but I think what I meant though is like, I think the kibbutzim in Otef Gaza and the Gaza envelope were like this weird like part of Israel that nobody really understood, and I feel like there's like an interesting way in which people from the center are being connected to the people from the south, and that there's some interesting points of light there. And I will also just share a personal one, which I'm going to share in my newsletter tomorrow. But so I wrote this really quite harrowing story about a family, a young couple who spent 27 hours locked in their mamad at Kfar Aza with a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old under intense Hamas fire. Both Hamas and the IDF thought they were not there because there were 2 safe rooms in their house. And so they were really like abandoned, and it was quite an ordeal. And the woman, the mom, told me the story in incredible detail. So I wrote a very long story with a lot of detail, which I will again share in the chat in a minute. Anyway, one of the little details was that when they first got in there to keep the 3-year-old quiet, they gave him a tablet and he watched his favorite YouTube show, which is called Coco Melon. And their main character on the show is a little baby named JJ, or a little kid named JJ. Anyway, JJ's parents read the foreword, and they asked JJ, who's actually a child named Cody, an 11-year-old named Cody, and he recorded a WhatsApp message, an audio message for baby Adam, 3-year-old Adam from Kfar Aza, and sent it to him. And we talk a lot about impact of journalism, and we try to like change laws or get people fired. And I don't know, I felt pretty good about JJ making an audio recording for Adam, and so that felt like that's a point of light that I'm holding on to personally.
Thank you. Speaker, I have every respect for your new role and your title, but I'm going to give you 1 minute because otherwise I'm worried that you're going to fall asleep, and Itai from Eretz Nehederet that we're about to hear from is also going to fall asleep, seeing as it's approaching midnight over there.
Right. Very quickly, as Jody said, the volunteering is just overwhelming. I mean, I could just tell you, as I said, on my street, I wrote a column about the fact that like there are no fathers on the street. So when the kids need someone to pump up the bikes, they come to me. And I'm not a really technical person, but I know how to pump, the tires of a bike. And we, my wife, we both work very hard, and we have guests almost every single day because of all these single moms. and it's a real issue. Like, it's not been discussed enough, but these families in a very difficult situation. High schools going to pick oranges, you know, not just, you know, adults. I think the Haredi community is going through a tremendous change, you know, something that may have had to take years. I think the liberal left is going through interesting issues. And also the Israeli right kind of understood that this government that they voted for was not as many things that they thought it was. I'm just hoping we can continue this, and that's it. That's my minute.
Speaker, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. And I think Elon may have been confused by just seeing our logo at the top of the screen in his session, but I just want to say a huge thanks to both the Jerusalem Post and to the Forward for joining us in this endeavor. I think possibly the largest global event that we've seen since the start of the war, bringing together people in 4 different time zones, including Netta in Germany. And on that note, thank you very much. I'll hand back to Netta, who's been incredible in the last couple of days.